something just doesn't sit right with me about the way Act 8 of the Nod Krai Archon quest ended. And it has nothing really to do with time travel, it's more like everything feels like it just wrapped up too neatly, too cleanly for it to be a real ending. And I kind of feel like the glitching end screen is a hint towards that. And the way I see it, there's two ways this end screen glitch hint can go. Either the glitch is because the Heavenly Principles is an AI, and the events of this quest cause the AI to glitch. Alternatively, and in my opinion a bit more likely, the glitch could be a hint that the last part of the Archon quest was actually part of one of Dottore's experiments. So you've probably seen the Heavenly Principles as an AI theory floating around out there. It is probably the most popular and common theory to come out of this Archon quest. And it's based almost entirely on the lore that we got from the Traveler's new outfit, which talks about how there's this AI on the twins' spaceship that took care of them during hibernation and also piloted the ship while looking for a new habitable planet to settle on. The going theory is that this spaceship AI actually turned into the Heavenly Principles, which would explain why the Heavenly Principles is sometimes referred to as if it's a machine. And this is a very plausible theory, and frankly, I don't really have a way to refute this theory, so I'm just going to proceed on the assumption that it is true, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time trying to prove it out because there are a lot of good theories out there on this right now, and I don't really think you need me rehashing everything you've probably already heard. Instead, I kind of want to focus on this second possibility, that the glitching ending screen is related to Dottore and not the Heavenly Principles. Because here's the thing. This quest has a repeating theme of characters separating their minds from their bodies for various reasons. Wanderer removed his core mind for computational purposes, Dottore transferred the minds of humans into animal bodies, Columbina split her conscious mind from her body after receiving the Trilune Authority, and Sandrone plays a part in the mind-body separation theme with her connection to the Narzissenkreuz Questline, which was all about mind-body dualism. And if we assume that Teyvat is indeed governed by an AI that calls itself the Heavenly Principles, then the Heavenly Principles must have some sort of mechanical machine-like vessel. So if Dottore is experimenting with splitting himself into pieces and moving minds into different bodies that don't belong to them, then what if this whole Trilune Authority seizure is just a diversion? Because I think it's possible his real plan was creating the right conditions for his mind to replace the AI we call the Heavenly Principles. After all, he's already a human mind inside of a mechanical body. He's already halfway there. All he's lacking is the authority. Now, is this whole video an excuse to write an analysis of Dottore, Columbina, and Sandrone while messing around with a couple of kooky thoughts I had during the Archon quest? Yes. Yes, it is. And this transition is also an excuse to talk about the sponsor of today's video, Eniba, a one-stop top-up shop for in-game currency, game keys, gift cards, and more. And they're my favorite top-up shop because they are TOS compliant, so you can top up your account without worrying about getting the ban hammer. And that's always a big concern with these third-party sites. And yeah, I know the discounts on other top-up sites look really enticing, but the advertised discounts aren't always the same ones that get applied at checkout. So even though it looks like Eniba is giving you a worse deal, they're actually giving you a better one. Because they have a really good cashback program that allows you to take a certain percentage of your previous purchase and put it towards your next one. And that cashback is often quite a bit higher than the discounts advertised on other sites. And it's far more consistent too, because other sites base their discounts on regional pricing, which fluctuates a lot, whereas Eniba's cashback system is just a flat percentage. Plus, using Eniba is easy. Just select the game you want, the item you want, and then enter your server and UID. Finish things up with your payment information and your purchase will end up in your account in a matter of minutes. Although it doesn't even have to be your account, you can always use Eniba to snag a little something to surprise a friend. And fun fact, if you buy a Blessing of the Welkin Moon pack right now, you'll be greeted every day by a little Columbina delivering Primo Gems into your account. I guess she wants you to use them to pull on her banner before it disappears. Or maybe Zabai is more your style. Her banner's just around the corner after all. I don't think Columbina will mind. The choice is yours, but I do recommend checking out the link in the description to see what Eniba's got in stock. You'll be glad you did. A big thanks to Eniba for sponsoring this video, and now we can kick off this bizarre analysis theory hybrid thing with some light philosophical discussion, because I need you to understand the mechanics of how all this works. Yes, the philosophy is necessary. It'll make sense later, I promise. I think, therefore I am. I'm sure you've heard this line before. It's a very famous quote from a book, Discourse on the Method, which was written by René Descartes in 1637. In this book, Descartes concludes that the mind is something that exists separately from the body, but also that the two share some kind of causal link. In his view, the mind was the truest form of the self. It existed long before the body did, and it would exist for long after the body perished. And that's why Descartes kind of thought of people as just things that think. The body is nothing more than a shell. It's a secondary form of existence and one that does not impact who we are as individuals. In philosophy, we call this theory substance or Cartesian mind-body dualism, and it's been subject to heavy criticism for years, especially on behalf of Gilbert Ryle. See, Ryle thought that distinguishing the mind and body as two separate but causally linked entities was absolutely ridiculous, because if it were true, then the mind could simply pilot any kind of body. It would just be a ghost within a machine. Because if the true form of you was exclusively your mind, which exists separately from the body, then you could, in theory, place your mind in any body and pilot it as if it were your own without losing your sense of self, hence ghost in the machine. Ryle proceeded to write an entire book, The Concept of Mind, explaining why the mind was actually an emergent part of the body, and thus the body and mind are a unified, inseparable concept. The body is the mind, and a mind can only exist within a body. To separate the two is to cease being you. What Ryle is talking about is the theory of embodiment, which in recent times has become a very hot topic in the field of robotics and AI. When discussing whether or not AI can gain sentience, or rather a sense of self, one must first reconcile whether or not a body is required for that sense of self. Cartesian dualists like Descartes would argue that no, a body is not required. The only thing that's required is that the thing thinks. Thinking proves that you exist, nothing else. But proponents of embodiment theory would argue the opposite. The conscious mind only emerges from the physical body. An AI lacks a physical body and therefore can never have a conscious mind emerge from it, unless it's given a physical body. And before you say anything, no, a computer's hardware does not count as an AI's body, because a body is not merely a vessel for the conscious mind. A body is a means of interacting and experiencing the external world, and it's these involuntary responses to these experiences that shape the way we think. Now, you may have noticed I've stopped talking about the mind and started talking about the conscious mind specifically. And that's because in a lot of ways, the physical form that we call the body is technically the unconscious mind. The body has the ability to act on its own. Muscle memory or quick reflexes can be a good example of this, or even emotional responses. Sure, we generally think of those as cognitive phenomena, but they're not really. They're chemical responses produced in the body, and your conscious thought doesn't really have a lot of control over them. So if you were to separate your conscious mind from the unconscious mind that we define as our body, do you really think you'd be the same person? In my personal view, the conscious mind and the unconscious mind of the body are two halves of a whole. They both make you, you. And the conscious mind emerges from the unconscious body. Think about a newborn baby, for example. Their body has a lot of involuntary responses that they're not aware of and they can't control. And it takes time for them to become consciously aware of how to move their body, or even what constitutes their body. That is the development of the conscious mind. Now, as I alluded to in the intro, this debate about what constitutes the self, the conscious mind, or the combination of the conscious and unconscious mind, is the underlying theme of the entire Nod Krai Archon quest. Although it's not that the quest is arguing that one is more correct than the other, it's more that the quests are exploring the concept of self and identity through Cartesian dualism and embodiment. Take the philosophical disagreements between Dottore and Sandrone, for example. Sandrone is a mechanical puppet, and puppets possess a core which should be the equivalent of a mind, or at least some sort of brain that houses conscious thought. Removing the core from the body can be done, but when separated for too long, the result is effectively death, as explained by Wanderer when he offered up his core for computational purposes. The puppet's core seems to be a reference to a critique of Cartesian dualism made by Immanuel Kant. Kant argued that even if you were like Descartes and believed that the mind was the truest form of the self and existed as some sort of incorporeal, eternal spiritual entity, it still requires the physical form in order to perceive reality. Without that ability to perceive reality, it would effectively lose all of its functions, which would result in a form of death. So basically, if the body dies, the mind still dies. So Sandrone and Wanderer are examples of embodiment, which is what Kant and Ryle argue for. Dottore, on the other hand, seems to think more in line with Cartesian dualists. He believed that the mind exists separately as a greater entity than the body, or even the entire physical realm, hence all the body-switching experiments and his foray into self-segmentation and robotic puppet bodies. To him, the ability to think is all that matters. And I want to take this comparison a step further because the difference in philosophies between Dottore and Sandrone is actually quite poetic because it mirrors the philosophical debates between René de Petrichor and Elaine Guillotine, a story we explored with the Narzissenkreuz Questline in Fontaine. So René de Petrichor was most certainly a Cartesian dualist. In fact, he's actually straight up a reference to Descartes. So he believed that the body was inconsequential, that the self would remain even if the shape of the body changed. And thanks to the world formula he developed based on Conrian text, René was able to predict the apocalypse. He knew that the entirety of Fontaine would be flooded by the primordial sea and everyone in Fontaine was gonna dissolve. In an effort to save as many Fontainians as he could, René started investigating ways to dissolve the boundaries between bodies. To René, the shape of the body didn't matter so much. So if he could preserve countless conscious minds inside of a giant body that was capable of resisting the flow of the primordial sea, then technically everyone would survive the apocalypse. And he believed so strongly in this that he performed the ritual to turn himself into an amorphous blob first, casting aside his physical identity as René and adopting the new collective identity of Narzissenkreuz. And then he proceeded to melt down and absorb a lot of other Fontainians. But Elaine Guillotine did not approve of René's plan, as he disagreed not just on the method, but the underlying logic. Elaine is more like Kant and Ryle. He believed that the conscious mind and the body were inseparable, and in fact that the conscious mind may emerge from the body. And this point of view is very fitting for him because Elaine and his little sister Marianne had an adoptive father named Emmanuel, who is a reference to Immanuel Kant, who also disagreed with the Cartesian dualism, as we already discussed. So Elaine parted ways with René and focused on his own research into robotics and emergent intelligence. And near the end of his life, he created his masterpiece, Sandrone, and sculpted her in the likeness of his deceased sister. But Elaine knew that Sandrone was not his sister, she was merely someone who looked like her. The consciousness of Marianne could never enter Sandrone's body because Sandrone's body already developed its own mind. Well, there's also the fact that Marianne technically fused with Lyris, another Oceanid, which caused both of them to have an identity crisis because they are neither Lyris nor Marianne, but it's not like Elaine knew that. So Sandrone became Elaine's proof that René's theory of the self was inherently flawed. But okay, quick recap. Cartesian dualists like René and Dottore believe that the mind and body are separate types of entities that have a causal link, and that the mind supersedes the body in terms of importance to the self. Meanwhile, those who subscribe to the embodiment theory, like Sandrone, Elaine, and Wanderer, believe that the mind and body are intrinsically linked and cannot be separated. The conscious mind emerges from the unconscious body, and thus they need each other to exist as a sense of self. But both Cartesian dualists and embodiment theorists agree on one thing, that the physical body is the boundary line between individuals. So I want to focus on this idea of the body being the boundary of the self, because while that concept is very straightforward when it comes to regular humans, things get a little bit weird when you start looking at gods. Humans are made primarily of biological components, so their shapes are rather fixed and firmly defined. But gods, in Genshin at least, do not have fixed shapes because they are not biological, they are elemental energy beings. That means the shape of their body can, and often does, change. Let's continue our Narzissenkreuz theming here and look at Oceanids, for an example. The boundary line between one Oceanid and another is so fragile that they have to avoid contact with each other lest they contaminate each other and cease being themselves. And they can also take any shape they want. That is the power of water. And while not elemental in the strictest sense, Columbina is also an energy-based entity. She's not a human of flesh and blood, she's made of Kuuvahki. She even flat out calls Kuuvahki her body in Act 8, and this is super important. The reason she can use Kuuvahki to see the same way that we see things with our eyes is because Kuuvahki is her body. It is an extension of herself. And she can create things from Kuuvahki because it is her. But this means that the boundary of Columbina's body is not the shape of the girl that we see, but anywhere and everywhere there is Kuuvahki. And this raises some very interesting possibilities when it comes to her presumed time travel, because time within the mind does not need to be linear. We can remember things out of order, or imagine things that have yet to happen. But if the mind is part of the body, then time can also be non-linear when inside the body. So if Kuuvahki represents the boundary of Columbina's body, then it can respond to her thoughts regardless of the linearity of time. So as long as her body exists, it responds to the influence of her conscious thoughts. I know that sounds confusing, but let me explain what I mean. In the Archon quest, Columbina passes through the Moon Gate and ends up in the prison of the Lunar Palace, which allegedly allows her to walk backwards through time as she experiences the gravitational pull between parts of her body in Nod Krai, the Kuuvahki, and her consciousness in the prison, which allows her to alter the events of the past, but only within the time period through which her body exists. So she can't go back farther than the moment of her birth, which happens to be the end point of the prison. It's at this point where she meets her 3 lunar sisters, who also possess a Kuuvahki of their own, although they don't call it that, which they then give to her so that she can escape the prison and become the new moon. None of that is a theory, that is what the quest tells us. However, if you view this part of the quest through the lens of time travel, it creates a really awkward bootstrap paradox that's so inconsistent with the way it's presented that it feels out of character for Genshin's writing team. And I promise I am not saying that because I'm a time travel hater. Time travel can be done well, and there are time travel stories that I do enjoy. I'm only a hater because good time travel is difficult to write well. So most of the time I feel like time travel stories end up feeling very deus ex machina and cop-out-like instead of interesting. And I really feel like this instance is one of those deus ex machina moments. Because the writers already laid the groundwork for a perfectly linear, time travel-free explanation that requires no changes to anything in the quest, and it neatly ties back to the arguments around the mind-body dualism theme that I was talking about. And I personally find that a whole lot cooler and more relevant to the plot than time travel. So humor me for a moment, and let's assume that the moons, in this case, are unreliable narrators. They don't really understand the full extent of what's happening. That will allow us to reinterpret the events of the quest in a more linear and thematically appropriate manner. In Genshin, when a god dies, there's often a burst of energy that's released because their body is not a solid biological mass, it's just condensed energy. So if the moon goddesses died, there should have been some kind of energy burst, right? That energy burst would have dissolved the boundaries of their self for each goddess, because their bodies would have been obliterated. And without the boundaries between the bodies, the goddesses may have merged into a single goddess, Columbina. This would really help solidify her status as a triple goddess archetype, 3 goddesses who take a single form. Like Hecate. Assuming this is true, which, is a little contentious because this is theory time, Columbina likely would not have been born fully formed. She would have first existed as a mass of moonlight, just pure Kuuvahki, which lingered throughout Nod Krai the same way the Tatarigami lingered throughout Inazuma after Orobashi died, or how the Salt and Saltaire lingered after Havria died. And that would mean that the entirety of Nod Krai was encased within Columbina's body. But this body was only capable of unconscious thought, muscle memory, emotions, that kind of thing. And it would take thousands of years for the human-shaped Columbina to be born. And I think this humanoid form of Columbina represents her conscious thought, her awareness. This conscious mind would have emerged from the unconscious body. But this human shape of Columbina is a bit like a newborn baby. She doesn't understand where the boundaries of herself are yet. Now, you could argue that Teyvat is just rejecting her, because they kind of say that in the quest. But even that doesn't really make sense, because if it was rejecting her, then why wasn't it rejecting Kuuvahki? Because Kuuvahki is also her. It sounds more like Teyvat was rejecting the original 3 moon sisters, and Teyvat stopped its rejection of the moon goddesses when Columbina became truly aware of the nature of her existence. And as Columbina gains awareness, she's able to move freely through the memories of herself, which also include not just her conscious memories of the last 500 years, but her body's memory of the last 6,000 years. So it's not so much that I think she travels through time, but that her body has been moving subconsciously, and she's only now becoming aware of her body's movements. That would mean everything from the pointing out of the books to the birth of Luonotar to the messages left on the wall were all involuntary responses from her body that her conscious mind merely became aware of later. However, you can also argue that her conscious thoughts echo through the time within her body, and since her body has existed for 6,000 years over the entirety of Nod Krai, then she could technically freely travel back and forth and manipulate to some extent anything that's in her body, because it's technically part of herself. But to that same end, the reason why the end point within the Lunar Palace is her birth is because that's her body's earliest memory. It remembers the conditions of her birth, but she's only now becoming conscious of those memories after passing through the moon gate and entering the lunar palace, which I still hold to be a mind palace, a cognitive space, as I've said in previous videos. In fact, I'd even go so far as to call this whole scene a Jungian metaphor of the journey of the self. Because as we saw at the end of Act 6, she sank into some watery depths before dissolving. And she wakes up in the lunar palace, which is an area covered entirely in water. In Jungian philosophy, water is a symbol of the self. It is a reflection of the self. So the unconscious or subconscious mind ends up being represented by water. So sinking into your unconscious mind is to sort of go on a spiritual development journey, to become aware of your unconscious thoughts, the thoughts that shape your conscious mind. And in Jung's view, everyone at one point in their life must embark on a journey of individuation or discovery of the self to undergo a sort of spiritual transformation. And this journey was a cognitive one that was represented by the act of allowing one to sink into the dark depths of the mind like one sinks into the sea. So René de Petrichor has this one line where he talks about that which lies beneath the great sea and how one must forsake the self in order to sink into the watery abyss so that he can be reborn as a holy infant or primordial human. And what he's basically saying is that you must submerge yourself in the waters of the self in order to face who you really are and be reborn as your complete and true self. So when characters like Durin and Columbina are shown sinking into deep waters that reflect pictures of themselves, they are effectively facing their own minds through their subconscious. They're undergoing spiritual growth that results in the death of the old and the rebirth of the new complete self. In that way, the water is a mirror that reflects the self and forces you to face it. And that's why Columbina's memories within the lunar palace manifest as golden mirrors. They're just reflections of her body's memories. And to that end, I'd go so far as to say her self-imposed blindness is similar to rejecting the knowledge of her birth and refusing to accept the completeness of herself. The moons are creations of the Dragon King, after all, and there is a famous Chinese idiom that says the painting of a dragon is only finished once you add in the eyes. That is the moment when you give birth to the creation. We saw something similar when Rex Lapis granted eyes to Ajdaha, so it's very appropriate to me that Columbina only opens her eyes once she's been truly reborn. Now, you can, of course, still think of all of this as time travel because she is technically still traveling through time, but only within her own body. And for those of you who watched my last video on block time models and storybooks, this is a very similar concept. Columbina's Kuuvahki body is effectively her personal storybook. It's the story of herself. And that is, once again, why she and Durin share a lot of imagery. But why does this matter, you ask? I spent a lot of time on this, and it seems kind of like a side note, right? But if you take a closer look at Kuuvahki, you'll notice that it comes in 3 colors: red, blue, and white, but like a whitish rainbowy color. But this is quite interesting to me because the other 3 goddesses that we met are red, blue, and white. But the lunar power that they wield is that whitish rainbowy color. Now, on the one hand, this feels like a little bit more confirmation that the 3 lunar goddesses actually merged together to form Columbina. However, in a previous video, I pitched the idea that red Kuuvahki is similar to phlogiston and represents the mind, while blue Kuuvahki is similar to the primordial sea and represents the body, the physical form, which houses the unconscious mind. And Columbina's human body did manifest from some primordial seawater that was found within the sanctum of the Oathbearer. And that pillar that 3D printed her out of the primordial seawater was connected to Natlan's dragons, who are all about phlogiston. So I do feel like this idea has a little bit more merit now than it did before. And as we saw in the Colors at a Space Quest, if you mix the red and blue Kuuvahki together, you get Kuuvahki's complete whitish rainbowy form. So while yes, it is very likely that the red and blue Kuuvahki is also referencing electromagnetism and that kind of stuff in order to sort of push the whole gravity narrative of the moons and stuff, it can also be a representation of Columbina's sense of self, the fusion of the conscious and unconscious minds, the mind and the body. And as soon as I started thinking of it that way, I realized something a little odd. Kuuvahki also represents the power of the light realm. It's the most primordial form of elemental energy, which is the stuff that all gods and dragons are made out of. But Nibelung was the first life form to be born of the light realm. All power of light and therefore the elements came from him. So if Kuuvahki is the body of Columbina and the red and the blue are kind of like different aspects of her, then is it possible that elemental energy is the fragmented body of Nibelung? Because if it is, then I would like to point out the fact that Teyvat is steeped in elemental energy, which would suggest that the entirety of Teyvat is encased in Nibelung's body, or at least what remains of him, the same way Nod Krai is encased in Columbina's body. And if that's true, then the primordial sea and phlogiston are Nibelung's equivalent of blue and red Kuuvahki. And this becomes even more interesting when you realize that Genshin draws heavy inspiration from the Nibelungen Lied opera, the opera from which Nibelung is named. That means Teyvat is the story of Nibelung, the opera of the Nibelungen Lied. And the Nod Krai Archon quest also has a very noteworthy opera being featured in it, because Dottore takes heavy inspiration from the Phantom of the opera, and surprisingly, so does Columbina. All the world's a stage and its people merely players. That's a line from William Shakespeare's As You Like It, and it's been mentioned a few times in game, and I've probably mentioned it even more times in different videos. But nowhere is this statement more true to Genshin than in Acts 7 and 8 of the Nod Krai Archon quest, because a stage is like the pages of a book, since both contain the story. So if, like I said, Nibelung's body encases Teyvat, then perhaps we should think of Teyvat as being the stage that performs the story of Nibelung. Likewise, Nod Krai is encased in Columbina's body, so it should be the story of Columbina. And the obvious villain of Columbina's story is Dottore, so naturally her story must also be his story, and I'm pretty convinced that the Doctor's story is the Phantom of the Opera. Yeah, I know it sounds weird, but hear me out. The Phantom of the Opera was originally a novel written by an investigative journalist who swore it was based on true events, or at least a rumor that there was a man living in the underground waterways beneath the opera house. In the book, the Phantom was born disfigured and abandoned by his parents, only to be adopted by a wandering performance troupe where he became an attraction at a circus-style freak show. But the Phantom turned out to be quite the skilled scholar and also a magician and a performer, whose notoriety eventually attracted Persian royalty, who then commissioned him to be the architect of a palace, which the Phantom then filled with secret rooms, tunnels, and doors, before it's eventually revealed that he was actually working as an assassin as well, and so, he was sentenced to execution. He escaped, built a ton more structures in other cities, then learned how to breathe underwater, and eventually wound up in France, where he built the Opera House, fully equipped with enormous cellars full of waterways, hidden passages, and an underground home for himself beneath the stage, where he would spend years composing his own opera. Now, the connections here aren't one-to-one, obviously, but Dottore was cast out by his family, he was persecuted by the people of Sumeru, and then he was sent into exile by Sumeru's royalty equivalent, only to later become a masterful inventor and magician under the care of the Fatui. And if the world is a stage within the opera of Nibelung, and the Doctor is trying to control the world, then you could argue that the Doctor also spent years trying to compose his own opera to control the story of the world with, just like the Phantom. And on a more meta level, The Phantom of the Opera is one of the most frequently adapted stories in modern history, with a whopping 40 adaptations in film alone. And every adaptation provides a slightly different take on the Phantom, with a slightly different personality, physical impairment, and backstory. And I can't help but think of Dottore's segmentation in the same vein as this, because each segment of Dottore is still Dottore, but they're all slightly different as well. Although the one that is the most different is found in the Genshin manga, which is curious, because not only is this the first version of the Doctor that we ever see, but he's also the only one with human eyes, which makes me wonder if this Doctor isn't a puppet like the rest of them. This would make sense to me, at least, because the manga version of the Doctor wears a mask that closely resembles the Phantom's most iconic mask. That's compared to what the segments wear. This version of the Doctor also has the most unique European fashion sense compared to the segments. Now, typically I would qualify all of this as loose reference material that's fun to know, but not really all that important, but then I realized that Columbina actually fits the role of Christine within the story. In fact, I'd argue that her trailer supports this with its choreography, faceless dancers, and even the roles assigned. So Christine was a skilled professional singer trying to make a name for herself in the opera, but she lacked the ability to put any emotion behind her voice and couldn't quite make the cut. So the Phantom, claiming to be the rumored angel of music, took her under his wing and tutored her until she had a voice that the novel describes as seraphic. You know, like the seraph, the type of angel that Columbina directly references with her 6 wings and hidden eyes. You can even make the argument that Columbina also lacked an understanding of emotions, even though she was a very prolific singer. And she did have a very unique talent or power that the Doctor was interested in. So she was under his care for a time, just like Christine was under the care of the Phantom. Now, the Phantom eventually falls in love with Christine and says he'll kill her lover, Raoul, if she does not agree to marry him. If you take out the romance part of things, this is the dynamic between Columbina, Dottore, and the Traveler. Dottore insists that Columbina remain with him so that he can use her power, and then he traps the Traveler, the person Columbina cares most about, in a prison, the same way the Phantom imprisoned Raoul. At this point in the quest, Columbina refuses to take the Doctor's offer and throws herself into the Lunar Palace, which I can't help but compare to the underground waterways beneath the Opera House in the novel. Because the novel also has Christine traveling to and from the Phantom's home via the waterways or mirrors, which is also what Columbina does in the Lunar Palace. She travels via mirrors in the underground waterways. Now, at the end of the novel, Christine actually outlives the Phantom and elopes with Raoul, returning only to bury the Phantom after he dies, as she promised. And that does line up with Columbina presumably killing Dottore and taking the Traveler to the moon. But like I said in the intro, this ending is too clean, too happily ever after. And it doesn't quite jive with the way that Columbina's trailer ends, strung up like a helpless butterfly caught in a spider's web. It certainly reads to me like she fell for a very clever trap on behalf of the Doctor. Now, what might that trap be, you might ask? Well, technically speaking, having the Trilune Authority, even if part of it was artificial, technically made that segment of the Doctor a god. And when gods die, their bodies often dissipate in a large burst of energy. So what if the same is true of Dottore? What if his plan was to convert one of his segments into light realm energy so that part of his body would enter a state similar to Columbina's Kuuvahki? Because think about this for a second. If Dottore truly wanted to become a god of the world, his goal wouldn't be the power of the moons at all. All 4 moons were weaker and had lower authority over Teyvat than both Nibelung and the Heavenly Principles, so why would he settle for anything less than the highest order of the land? To me, seizing the Trilune Authority feels more like a stepping stone, a means for Dottore to elevate himself to a position where he can reach a higher level of authority more easily. To excise his self and convert his body into raw energy means he'd reach a level of substance compatibility with other energy-like beings. He'd be like a tiny Oceanid trying to quietly take over the body of a much larger Oceanid by merging with them. That tiny fragment of his body would claim the rest of that Oceanid as his own body, and then it could be controlled by his conscious mind. Metaphorically speaking, he's not actually turning into an Oceanid. And to that end, I'm sure you've all noticed that Dottore is always in possession of a strange blue liquid, and I've theorized before that this might be something akin to primordial seawater, a claim I made solely because we were in Fontaine at the time, and his thematic connections to René de Petrichor made me wonder if he had done something similar and melted down his original body so he could course through the veins of his puppet segments. Pouring the water of his self into different vessels seems like a straightforward enough process. And technically speaking, the water is powering or at least living within a human-shaped machine. Meanwhile, both Nibelung's elemental energy and Columbina's Kuuvahki are also used to power machines. And the Heavenly Principles also appears to most likely be a machine powered by an AI that controls the world, which is encased in Nibelung's body, so could you reason that the Heavenly Principles is to some degree manipulating Nibelung's remnants, rewriting the story of the Nibelung opera in the process? Is it possible that the Heavenly Principles is like a new conscious mind that hijacked the physical form of Nibelung? And if I may go out on a limb for a minute, because every theory of mine needs some kind of crazy in it, I want to point out that every single one of Dottore's segments is entirely blue from tip to toe, which in my mind makes them entirely primordial sea coded, right? Like unconscious mind coded. The only red that would represent the conscious mind in his design is his single eye. But that's not true of every version of the Doctor that we've seen, now is it? Because the Doctor of the manga wears quite a bit of pinkish red to accompany his bright red eyes. So is it possible that the manga version of the Doctor looks so different from all of the segments because he's the original and also the representative of the conscious mind of the Doctor? Because if so, then this dissolved segment of his becomes an extension of his body, and if that part of the body seeps into the Heavenly Principles God machine, then this version of the Doctor could control it the same way Columbina controls Kuuvahki. I would find this very fitting because the Doctor is from Sumeru originally, the homeland of all things cognitive manipulation. From the Akasha to the Golden Slumber to the Hive Mind projects to even Apep herself, they've got it all. And at this point, I kind of feel like all of it was somehow foreshadowing Dottore's ultimate plan. Because even if my color theory assessment is totally off base, it's very possible that we've been dealing with 2 different segments of the Doctor in Nod Krai the exact same way we were dealing with 2 segments in Sumeru. A couple of very observant theorists took a close closer look at that scene between the Doctor and the Traveler and noticed that the Doctor's appearance and behavior was inconsistent, almost like there were two of him, one of them with a Tri-Lune authority and one of them without. I'll leave a full link to their analysis below because it's very interesting. And of course, selfishly, I'm hoping they're right because it would support my idea that Dottore is not done and defeated here. There's still at least one of him left waiting to initiate the finale of his grand plan, discarding his physical form until he is nothing more than a mind. And what remains of him will seep into the bones of the world, usurping the vessel that contains the heavenly principles like a ghost in the God machine. And when that process is complete, he'll not only be the god of the world, but he'll be the phantom of the wrong opera. And I think that the glitching end screen is a sign that his plan is working. Now, I don't know how many of you picked up on it, but I have written a very similar video to this one way back in Fontaine. At the time, I was taking some really wild swings just based on the themes and references that I saw between the Doctor and Renee and like what was going on in the Archon quest and stuff, and also a bunch of Evangelion references which are still relevant. But that video ended up being a very odd case of correct math, wrong answer, because the entire analysis almost is completely on point. It aged very well as it applies perfectly to the Nod Krai quests. Where I miscalculated was on the identity of Christine. It wasn't Farina, it was Columbina. And boy, did the comments roast me for that video. And rightly so, because at the time, I was wrong. But let this stand as proof that even the wildest theory has the potential to come true if you wait long enough. But yeah, after playing through this quest, I really wanted to revisit the ideas that I presented in that video and update them with our current information. And it turned out pretty well. As for the last thing I wanted to say, it's actually more of a question, really. When the Traveler got to the moon, they seem to have only checked the ship's flight logs, which strikes me as very odd because if there was an AI caretaker and pilot companion on board, then why didn't the Traveler check on it too? I can only really think of three possibilities here. Possibility 1, they checked on the AI but just didn't mention it to Columbina. I don't like this possibility because it's annoying, so I'm going to ignore it. Possibility 2, the Traveler doesn't remember the AI. This seems plausible if the AI is the heavenly principles and kind of took over the entire planet in order to create a nice habitable world for the Travelers. Ignorance is bliss and all that. But possibility 3 is perhaps the most interesting one to me, though. It's the possibility that the Traveler knows what happened to the AI. Now, most theorists seem to agree that Paimon is a part of the AI because Paimon is the demon most loyal to Lucifer and the twins reference Lucifer, and also because the game system male comes from Paimon, so perhaps Paimon the traveling companion is to the heavenly principles what Luonotar is to Columbina. This would mean that the Traveler knows who Paimon is, and it would kind of change the context of the Traveler asking their sibling the question of whether or not they hated the heavenly principles, and why the sibling had a very inconclusive answer. I had a similar theory to this back in version 3.4, I think it was. It was back when Azimon came out. I did not expect for that to ever come up again, and yet here we are. Anyway, that's all I really had to say, so let me know your favorite possibility in the comments. I read way too many books for this theory, so I'm gonna go rest my brain. Thank you all so much for watching. Y'all bring me so much joy, so I will definitely look forward to seeing you all in the next one. Bye for now.